Hi there. Greetings. I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Readings Locke's second treatise. Yesterday we looked at chapter 7, which was of political or civil society. Um, Today we're going to be looking at chapter 8, which is the beginning of political society. Again, as I said last time, this is this chapter 8 is, I think it's the second largest. I'm just checking my notes here. Um, Chapter 8 is the second largest. It has 28 sections in it. Um, um, so hope it's not going to be, hope, not, hope an hour, I think, but maybe over an hour. It won't be 2 hours of class time. And had the big, the third one. So we'll see. We'll try to get as much as done as possible. So let's look at this. Chapter 95. Men being, as have been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subject to the political power of another without his consent. So therefore, in other words, in the state of nature, you're free. Everyone is born free, equal, this, and no one can be put into political authority or power without consent. Only the only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another in the enjoyment in a secure enjoyment of their properties and a great security against any that are not in it. So therefore, this idea that you join it for the safety of your property and your safety, your security, your life, your liberty, and your property, right? And particularly property, okay? Particularly against those who are not in it, okay? This and this any number of men may do, because it injures not the freedom of the rest. They are left as they were in the liberty of the state of nature. When any number of men have so consented to make one community or government, they are thereby presently incorporated and make a one body politic, wherein the majority have a right to act and conclude the rest. So, okay, the body politic exists, but then there's this idea that once you have this, you have a majority. Then decisions have to be made, and decisions are going to be made by majority. Now, the argument why majority, not unanimous, because unanimous would mean it'd be that any one individual will be able to block it. This becomes the arbitrary will of one. Here, there's at least the majority, therefore, the many of this, you have to get consensus. You have to build a consensus here. 96. For when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, and have whereby made a community one body, with a power to act as one body, which is only by the will and determined of the majority, for that which acts any community being only the consent of the individuals in it, and being necessary to that which is one body to move one way, it is necessary the body should move that way, whether the greater force carries it, which is the consent of the majority, or else it is impossible that it should act or continue to act or continue one body, one community, which the consent of every individual that united into it agreed that it should. And so everyone is bound by that consent to be concluded by the majority. And therefore, we see in the assemblies empowered to act by positive law, where no number is set by the positive law which empowers them. The act of the majority passes for the act of the whole, and of course, which of course determines as having the law of nature and reason and the power of the whole. In other words, in other words, the positive law determines that this majority passes. This is for the act of the whole, and of course determines as having by the law of nature and the reason the power of the whole. So therefore, in other words, it's kind of like this. Wait a minute. Why should the majority have the power of the whole? Well, because you've agreed. The argument from reason is that you've joined this. You've consented to join this, and this is one body, and therefore you've agreed this is one body, and therefore it's going to make a decision how you're going to do it. And, okay, this is the kind of the logic of this, the thing. But okay, what about this? This is questions we have. You come together. You join this body for the safety and security of your life and property, right? And therefore, these decisions are to guarantee the security of your life and property. So therefore, decisions have to be made. And if you're going to have decisions made, then the best way to broadly do it is to have a consensus on it. And the majority is the closest to consensus. If it was unanimity, then any individual could block it. This would be, again, similar to arbitrary rule, one could say. So let's continue this 97. And thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society to submit to the determinations of the majority and to be concluded by it, or else this original compact, whereby he and others incorporated into one society, would signify nothing and be no compact, if he be left free and under no ties than he was before in the state of nature. For what appearance would there be of any compact? What new engagement if he no further tied to any decrees of that society than he thought himself fit and did actually consent to? This would be still as great a liberty as he himself had before the compact, or anyone else in the state of nature had, who may submit himself and consent to any acts of it if he thinks fit. In other words, okay, wait a minute. So therefore, this idea is that you have to once you join this thing, you have to abide by the rules. And abide by the rules is that for the logic of the system to work, you need to have it's ruled by the majority, and then you have to obey. You're obliged to obey the majority decision. If you don't want to obey, you think, no. That's what I don't agree with that majority decision. The majority has no desire to determine what is right and wrong. I think they're wrong, so I'm going to ignore them. Okay. Well, but then you're above the law. You're above the magistrate. You're above the law in a sense, and then you're appealing to a right in the state of nature that you gave up by joining into this community. Okay. Then therefore, this is the case that you seem. In other words, once you're in, and once you're in, you have to abide by the majority. If you don't want to abide by the majority, then you're kind of saying, well, I'm not in really, okay? But I want to get the benefits of it, but not pay the costs of it, okay? Free rider. 98. It is, for if the consent of the majority shall not, in reason, be received as the act of the whole, and conclude every individual, nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything be the act of the whole. But such a consent is next to impossible ever to be had. If we ever consider the infirmities of health, the avocations of business, in which a number, though much less than that of commonwealth, be necessary to keep many away from the public assembly, to which, if we add the varieties of opinions and the contrary of interests, which unavoidably happens in all collections of men, coming into society upon such terms would be like Cato coming into the theater only to go out again. Such a constitution as this would make the mighty Leviathan of a shorter duration than the feeblest creature, and not let it outlast the day it was born. The mighty Leviathan, right? This is again this clear reference to Hobbes here. Was born as. Therefore, the Leviathan would not survive the duration of its birth. If it's every individual can make it and unmake it. In other words, that if once you joined it, you could decide, I'm not going to buy it. Everyone has to agree upon this, and that's going to be like, well, once we did it, but then if we're going to constantly have the recreation of that same consent every time, that might not happen. It might short live, right? And not last the day it was born, in which cannot be supposed till we can think that rational creatures should desire and constitute society only to be dissolved. In other words, it doesn't make any sense. That we want society, but then we're going to dissolve it. Okay, for where the majority cannot conclude the rest, there cannot act one body, and consequently will be immediately dissolved again. Okay, so therefore, if the majority cannot rule, then there's not a one body. Then it's that society has been dissolved. Okay, notice this again. Here's Locke seems to switch from the term community and society. He switches it like it's the same term. And I think that in Locke, this is where we get the blurring of something. And I think this is where, for Aristotle and the ancient community and the Greeks, there's only community. And community is the scope of the political. And that the city, the polis, is the perfect community. The perfectus communitas in Latin, right? It is that embodiment of the community that it fulfills the nature of human community, of human living together, right? Fulfillment. Societas, the Latin, there's no equivalent word for society in Greek, in Aristotle or Plato. It's only communitas, or koinoia, in Greek koinoia. In Latin, we get societas, which means in Latin originally it's the business agreement. It's contractual. These are contractual relationships, not social. That these bonds and communitas seems to also be as much voluntary and involuntary. It is both voluntary. Involuntary relations are as much a form of communitas. In fact, the communitas seems to be kin, family ties, kin groups, which are basically you don't choose to be a member of the family. Whereas societas is voluntary, it's contractual. It's relationship between businesses. That's where the societas usually meant businesses, industries. In Latin law, societas is usually societies were the first aspect of a corporation in that sense, right? The contractual relationship. These are the corporations or these agreements between things. Societies also became the relationship between cities to each other. So in the Greeks, there's a word for this, alliances, right? These alliances. Well, for the Romans, you had these, that the cities had relationships to each other, or kings or tribes or peoples had relationships to each other in this contractual sense with Rome or another larger city. And that these became, and of course, these were done for the benefit of the stronger party, right? This is not political rule. This is not a social, as we would understand it, some community in that sense. The community benefits in other words, the nature of the community, all members are equally part of it and are therefore to be benefited, have equal right to benefit of this. And that the purpose of this is beneficial of all. A contractual relationship, yes, the parties are in it for the benefit, but this is completely voluntary in that sense. And that, in fact, that usually they're not entered into unless it's involuntary. Where a community, it's not voluntary entered into. You're into it. You're born into it. So Locke's switching of this seems to saying that there's no difference here. Is actually very interesting. This leads to the confusion of the term. Locke furthers the confusion of these two words. Now, why am I talking about this? I think it's important that we pay attention to that, because this is the difference between Aristotle and Plato here. Now, Aristotle and Plato and Locke, and later Hobbes as well. 799. Whatsoever, therefore, out of the state of nature into a community must be understood to give up all the powers necessary to the end for which they unite society, to the majority of the community, unless they expressly agreed in any number greater than the majority. This and this is done by barely agreeing to unite into one political society, which is all the compact that is or needs be between the individuals and that enter into to or make up a commonwealth, and thus that which begins the actual which actually begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of freemen capable of being a majority to unite and incorporate into such society. That is, and this is that, and only, and that only, which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. So this is, in other words, only government by consent. This is Locke. This is again Locke and Hobbes agree that consent is the only thing that gives legitimacy to a government. If the government has no consent, if it's by force and not there's no consent to it, then it's illegitimate in this sense. Section 100. To this I find two objections. First, that there are no instances to be found in story of a company of men independent of equal one amongst another that met together and in this way began and set up a government. Secondly, in light in the impossible of it is impossible of right that men should do so, because all men being born under government, they are to submit to that and are not liberty to begin a new one. So the two arguments. One, there's no situation that men are out there independent and they form to do this, right? And second, it's impossible that men should do so because they're all born under government and that they are submit to that and they're not liberty to begin a new one. Those are two conditions, right? To the first, there is this answer, that it is not at all to be wondered that history gives us but a very little account of men that live together in the state of nature. The inconveniences of that condition and the love and want of society no sooner brought any number of them together, but they, presently united and incorporated, if they design to continue together, if they decide to, and if we may not suppose men ever to have been in the state of nature, because we hear not much of them in such a state, we may as well suppose that the armies of Salamander or Xerxes were never children, because we never hear of them until they were men, embodied in armies. And government is everywhere antecedent to records, and little seldom come in amongst a people, till a long continuation of civil society has, by other more necessary acts, provided for their safety, ease, and plenty. And then they begin to look after the history of their founders and search into their origins, their original origins, right? That's origins, right? When they have outlived the memory of it. For it is with commonwealths as with particular persons. They are commonly ignorant of their own births and infancy. And if they know anything of their original origins, they are beholden for it to the accidental record that others have kept of it. In other words, a child, you don't remember being born, okay, or maybe a bit of your infancy, only because other people have records of it that you know it. Okay, so that's what he's saying here in that sense. And what's true about an individual is also true about political communities. And because political communities, in the state of nature, there's no records. There's not going to be any records. Records emerge out of civil society or society, and that therefore only when society is long established and records are kept, then there's memory. And usually they want to know the origins. The first history is about the origins of our society, where we came from, right? And therefore, this is like this. And he says, and those what we have of the beginnings of any polities in the world except that of the Jews, where God himself immediately interposed, with in which favors are not at all, which favors not at all paternal domination, are all either plain incidents of such a beginning as I have mentioned, or at least have manifest footsteps in. So in other words, any records we have, the Bible offers us the book of Genesis, and that offers us the clearest record and doesn't defend paternal monarchy in this sense. And then all the other records that don't do that also follow this position of what we would have so far discussed here, or discussed early in the previous chapter. 102. He must shew a strange inclination to deny evident matters of fact, whether it agrees not with his hypothesis, who will not allow that shew a strange inclination to deny evident matter of fact when it does not agree with his hypothesis. I did a I slip, sorry. Is that a repeat? That's a repeat of the text. As a matter of fact, with his hypothesis, who will not show. Okay, let me look here quickly. Sorry. Oh, that's a text error. Oh, we have a text error. Oh, we have a text error. So this is right here a text error. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Because right here it goes right. Who will not allow at the beginning of Rome in Venice, whereby the uniting together of several men and free and independent of one another, amongst whom there was no natural superiority or subjection. And if Joseph Akata's word may be taken, he tells us that in many parts of America there was no government at all. So now, in other words, I'm going to quote from the Cox thing here because there's a note here. The Roman Venice account, this is here the founding. He looks at Machiavelli's Discourses, Book 1, a book Locke owned at least by 1678, right? Locke's treatment here of the founding of ancient cities is obviously very sketchy. That sketchiness is connected to the need to emphasize the origin of legitimate government in consent. So there was the lack of evidence of other cities is because he makes the insistence on, and then therefore he violates his own principle, right? He says it's strange. Just maybe that's why there's a double in this thing here by accident, because Locke engages in this very point here. Now, Joseph Costa, a word, right? Joseph Costa was a Spanish missionary, and his natural and moral history of the Indies appeared in English translation in 1604. A close comparison of Locke and Acosta suggests that Locke has given a very partial account, to say the least, of Acosta's description of the Indians. Consider just one remark by Acosta that the Indians go into troops like savage beasts, chapter 4, chapter 19. In other words, again, this is a great thing here. Now, in other words, let's look at the next line here, right? No government at all. Here there are great and apparent conjectures. He says that these men, speaking of those of Peru, for a long time had neither kings or commonwealth, but lived in troops, as they do to this day in Florida. The Cherokee, those of Brazil, and other nations, which have no certain kings, but as occasions is offered in peace and war, they choose their captain as they please. This is from book 1 and chapter book 1, chapter 1, or C 25 of that of this is a natural and moral history of the Indies, right? It is said. If it is said that every man there was born subject to his father, or the head of the family, that the subjugation due from a child to the father took not away his freedom of uniting into what political society he thought fit, had been already proved. He's done this already, right? But be that as it will, these men, it is evident, were actually free, and whatever superiority some politician now would place in any of them, they themselves claimed it not, but by consent were all equal, till by the same consent they set a rule over themselves, so that their politic societies all began from a voluntary union and the mutual agreement of men freely acting in choice of their governors and forms of government. Okay, this is like, in other words, political society begins in a voluntary union and mutual agreement of men firmly acting in the choice of their governors and forms of government. I hope those who went away from Sparta and with Pilatus, mentioned in Justin 1 3, chapter C4. I think Justin, this is again to Justin, history of Justin, which is what? This is the Roman jurist, right? His book, History of the World, based on the last works of Trogus Pompeius, just as Locke in the immediate preceding section gave a very partial account of Acosta's description, right, of the Indians in Peru, so he gives a very partial account of Justin's description of what Pelleas and the other Spartans did. What they did, in fact, was to attack the citadels of the Tartines, drive out the inhabitants, and then claim the place for their own. In short, the case of founding new commonwealth by conquest. Okay, so in other words, he's going to say something here which is counter to the facts of the source he is quoting from. Right. Um, in other words, adjust the government over themselves by their own consent. Thus, I have given 7 examples out of history of people, and all these examples are not what they say. He distorts them. He misrepresents them. Both Acosta and Justin here. Thus, I have given several examples out of history of people free and in the state of nature that being met together incorporated and began a commonwealth. And if the want of such instances of an argument prove that government were not, nor could not be so begun, I suppose the contender for paternal empire were better let it alone and urge it against natural liberty. For if they can give so many incidents out of history of government being upon paternal right, I think, though as best an argument from what has been to what should of right be, has no great force. In other words, what should have been versus what to right should have been. In other words, this is the is and ought, right? What ought to be. In other words, this is what is, right? Just because this ought to be is not as because something ought to be doesn't mean it is. Okay, this is that famous is and ought argument, right? He says, I think one might, without any degree of danger, yield them the cause. But if I might advise them in the case, they would do well not to search too much into the origins of government, as they have begun de facto, lest they should find at the foundations of most of them something very little favorable to the design they promote, such as a power as they and such as a power as they contend. Now, this is like, well, you better not go look too closely because you're going to discover that the origins of things are not going to be so favorable to the thing that you claim it is, right? That government rule is. And I think that's a kind of a saying. He's bluff. He's upping the stakes, saying that if you go don't go really investigating the origins of government, you guys. You don't believe me, because if you look too closely, you're going to discover that the truth of the matter doesn't support your position either. That is hardly really an argument here. 104. But to conclude, reason being plain on our side, that men are naturally free, and examples of history showing that government of the world, that were begin in peace, had their beginnings laid on that foundation, and were made by the consent of the people, there can be little room for doubt, either where the right is, or what the opinion or practice of mankind about the first erectings of government. Okay. Uh, Again, this is, I'm sorry, this is like, um, there's this really um, problems here. Again, this is why Cox is pretty good here. Um, this is that line de facto. Remember, we said this above in chapter 104 above. Okay, we just read it, right? We just, um, in three, up here, right? De facto, right? Ten to, is it de facto? De facto right here, right? This and it should fit, look into the origins of government, right? Well, Cox has an art thing, job of government de facto. Locke constantly again looking too closely into de facto origins of government. Again, see Machiavelli Discourses 1 and Locke, section 121, where he refers to men forming a new commonwealth in vacus locus, or in empty space, which is certainly not the case of Paulus and others and the Spartans. Okay, and this is why. And then there's that other thing, and other things being the case, right? So let's go look at the next paragraph here. Um, he did this thing about consider people like the doubt. Um, did this one under 105. I will not deny that if we look back as far as history will direct us towards the origin or origins of Commonwealth, we shall generally find them under the government and administration of one man. And I am also apt to believe that where a family was numerous enough to subsist in itself by continued entire together, without mixing with others, as it often happened, where there was much land and few people, government commonly began in the father. For the father, having by the law of nature some power with every man else to punish, as he sought fit, any offenses against the law, might thereby punish his transgressing children, even when they were men, out of their pupillage, and they were very likely to submit to his punishment, and all join with him against the offender in their terms, giving him thereby power to execute the sentence against any transgressor, and so in effect makes him the lawgiver and governor over all that remained in conjunction with his family, and his fitted and was fitted to be trusted. Paternal affection secured their property and interest under his care, and the custom of obeying him in their childhood made it easier to submit to him rather than any other. Again, this repeats what he says earlier, right? If Therefore, they must have one to rule them, as government is hardly to be avoided amongst men that live together, who so likely to be the man as that he was their common father, unless negligence, cruelty, or any other defect of mind or body made him unfit for it. But when when either the father died and left his next heir, for want of age, wisdom, or courage, or other qualities, less fit for rule, or where several families met and consented to continue together, there it was not to be doubted. It was not to be doubted, but they used their natural freedom to set to set up him whom they judged the ablest and the most likely to rule well over them. Comfortable hitherto, hereuntil, we find the people of America, who, living out of the reach in the conquering was out of the reach of the conquering sword and spreading domains of the two great empires of Peru and Mexico, enjoy their own natural freedom through ceteris paribus. They commonly prefer prefer their height of their deceased king. Um, the prefer the hair. They prefer the hair of this king. They commonly prefer their deceased king. Yet if they find him any weak or incapable, they pass him by and set up the stoutest and bravest men as their ruler. Now, all things being equal, right? This is that line. Yeah, all things being ceteris paribus. Uh, Thus, though looking back as far as records give us any account of the people of the world and the history of nations, we commonly find governments to be in one hand, yet it destroys not destroys not that which I affirm, viz., the beginning of political society depends on the consent of individuals to join into and to make one society, who, when they are thus incorporated, might set up what form of government they thought fit. But this having given occasion to men to mistake and think that by nature government was monarchical and belonged to the father, it may not uh, it may not be amiss here to consider why people in the beginning naturally pitched this pitched this pitched upon this form, which, though perhaps the father preeminently might, in the first institution of some commonwealth, be give a rise to and place in the beginning the the power in one hand, yet it is plain that the reason, the continuation, the form of government in a single person, was not in regard or respect to paternal authority, since all petty monarchies, that is, almost all monarchies, near their origins have been commonly, or at least occasionally, elective. In other words, he makes a point about the early monarchies are elective in that sense. That if you look at the histories of most monarchies, they're not absolute; they're elective in that sense, and that they only become absolute after a period of time of centralization of power, like that. If you students of Poland, the Polish kings were not absolute; they were elective. They might have dynastic succession, but then when there's lack of then they get elected again. So therefore, his argument is that if you look closely at the monarchies, it doesn't lead to the argument of and that the legitimization comes from paternal power. Yes, inheritance of a dynastic order does tend to do this, but not that. So Locke is kind of making a case here for his position. First, then, in the beginning of things, the father's government of childhood, the childhood, those sprung from him, having accustomed them to the rule of one man, and taught them that where it was exercised with care and skill, with affection and love to those under it, it was sufficient to procure and preserve to men all the political happiness they sought for in society. It was no wonder that they should pitch upon and naturally run into that form of government, which from their infancy they had been all accustomed to, and which by experience they had found both easy and safe. To which, if we add that monarchy being simple and most obvious to men, whom neither experience had instructed in forms of government, nor the ambition or insolvent of empire had taught to beware of the encroachments of prerogative or the inconveniences of absolute power, which monarchy and succession was apt to lay claim to and bring upon them, it was not at all strange that they should not much trouble themselves to think of methods of restraining any exorbitance of those who they had given the authority over them, and of balancing the powers of government by placing several parts in of it in different hands. Now, he's reporting here the Roman problem. The Romans, original form was the Romans gave Rome a kingdom, right? There was a monarch, king. But the king went too powerful. This is why the Romans had this fear of Rex. The kings were too abusive, too powerful. They acted. They They act again. The king believed the claim was this idea that king was a father, and since fathers had the power of life and death, arbitrary life, the power of taking life and death, the Rex became so fearful in that sense. This is why, and the Romans were so terrified. Once the Romans rebelled against their Rex, what did they do? They separated the prerogative power of executive into two councils. Right? They divided up the Rex power. They took all the power that was unified and they divided it. Right? For the purposes of what? To limiting it. Okay. This is what I think. This is where Locke does get this idea from. The They had neither felt the oppressions of tyrannical dominion, nor did the fashion of their age, nor their possessions or way of living, which afforded very little matter for covetousness or ambition, gave them any reason to apprehend or provide against it. Maybe some water. I lost my place. Empire taught them encroachment, and it's strange that they should not, without think of themselves restraining any exorbitance to which they had given one authority over them, and of balancing of the power of government by placing hands in different parts. Okay, I remember that. They had neither felt the oppression of tyrannical dominion, nor did the fashion of their age, nor the possessions or way of living, which afforded little matter of covetous submission, give them any reason to apprehend or provide against it. And therefore, it was no wonder they put themselves in such a frame of government, as was not only, as I said, most obvious and simple, but also best suited for their present state and condition. So, in other words, this is a kind of historicism that once you have certain epochs of history, there's certain types of things here, um, which understood more in need of defense against foreign invasions and injuries than the multiplicities of laws. The equality of a simple poor way of living, confining their desires within the narrow bonds of each man's small property, made few controversies, and so no need for many laws to decide them, or a variety of offices to superintend the process, or to look after the execution of justice, where there were but few trespasses and few offenders. Since then, those who are like one another so well as to join into society cannot but suppose to have some acquaintance and friendship together, that some trust one another, that they could not have greater apprehensions of others that than the one of another, and therefore their first care and thought cannot but be supposed to be how to secure themselves against foreign force. It was natural for them to put themselves under a frame of government which best serves that end, and choose the wisest and bravest men to conduct them in wars and lead them out against their enemies. And in this chief, and in this chiefly to be their ruler. So therefore, warfare, security. In other words, their limitedness of their condition and property. There's few needs for laws and complexities. Their societies were not that complex. Their needs were not that great. Their differences, because they were basically the same people and the same families and the same things, all knew each other, and they had therefore customs and norms that regulated things. They weren't so diverse and different. They had drastically different interests, and therefore, rather, what was feared is the other groups and threats to their group, and therefore they needed someone to defend them, someone lead them and defend them against the others, and therefore that's what justifies this king in that sense. Section 108. Thus we see that the kings of the Indians in America, which is still a pattern for the first ages in Asia and Europe, while the inhabitants were too few for the country, and want of people and money to give no temptation to enlarge their possessions of land, or contest for wider extent of ground, are little more than generals of their armies, and though they command absolutely in war, yet at home and in times of peace they exercise very little dominion, but and have but a very moderate sovereignty and resolution of peace and war, being ordinarily either in the people or council, though the war itself, which admits not a plurality of governors, naturally dissolves the command into the king's sole authority. So his argument is that war leads us to the situation. Again, this look at Iliad. Look at the Iliad. The kings are more powerful when at war, but at home, their consuls are more consul. This is how the Iliad describes the different kings and the limited of their authority in that sense. Um, Again, if you looked at Aristotle's book 3 and the discussion of kingship in chapter 15, the last 4 chapters, the last 5 chapters of book 3, um, Aristotle talks about that most kings emerge out of this original concept of the generals and all this. And in fact, he does this again in book 4. Is it book? I think book 4, where he talks about this a little bit about the origins of this certain earlier societies, how they emerge out of something. There was the smallness of the state, the smallness of the group, led to kind of like the division of labor, where the warrior would do it, and therefore this became the basis by which kings emerged, right? And Locke seems to be repeating that here to defend his position. Chapter 109. And thus, in Israel itself, the chief business of the judges, the first kings, seem to have been to be captains in war and leaders of their army, which is signified by going out and before the people, which was to march forth to war and home again in the heads of their forces. Again, this is the book of Judges, which is not Kings. The judges were kind of before Kings, and then when the failure of the judges and the people gave a king, that was that's the story of that things, right? Appears plainly in the story of Jebediah. The Amorites making war upon Israel, the Gladiates in fear said to Jebediah, a bastard of their family, whom they had cast off, and an article with him, if he will assist them against the Ammonites, to make him their ruler, which they do in these words. And the people made him the head and captain of them. Judges chapter 11, verse 11, which was, as it seems, all one as to be judged. And he judged Israel, Judges 12:7. That is, was their captain, general, 6 years. So when Jotham upbraids the Shemaites with the obligations they had to Gideon, who had been their judge and ruler, and he tells them, he fought for you and adventured his life far and delivered you out of the hands of Midian. Judges 9:17. Nothing mentioned of him but that he did as a general. And indeed, that is all is found in the history of any of the rest of the judges. I'm going to read this is on a note about this going out before the people. Locke alludes the Old Testament passage that treats the practices of leaders of Jews, in particular the account of Moses asking the successors, right, and therefore these kind of things. And again, there's no other note on this. Let's continue. as the judges, and Ecumenic particularly, in other words, nothing mentioned of him when he did in general. Indeed, that all is found in history or any of the rest of the judges. And Abimelech particularly is called king, though at most he is but their general. And when, being weary uh, uh, of ill conduct conducted by Samuel's son, the children of Israel desired a king, like all the other nations, to judge them, and to go out before them and fight their battles. 1 Samuel 8:20. God granting their desire, says to Samuel, I will send thee a man, and thou shalt appoint him to be captain of my people Israel, and that he may save my people out of the hands of the Philistines. Uh, 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 just as Samuel's 9:16. As if the only business of king had been to lead out the armies and fight in their defense. And accordingly, in his inauguration, pouring a vial of oil upon him, Saul calls him that the Lord has anointed him to be captain over his inheritance. Again, this is Samuel, 1 Samuel 10:1, verse 1. And therefore, those who after Saul being solemnly chosen and stood as king by the tribes of Mipah were unwilling to have him their king, made no other objection but this: how shall this man save us? 5, chapter 5:27. And if they should have said, this man is unfit to be our king, not having skill enough and conduct enough in war to be able to defend us. And when God resolved to transfer the government to David, it is in these words, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man out of his own heart, and the Lord hath commanded him to be a captain over his people. I think this is Samuel 8, 2 Samuel 8. No, yeah, this First Samuel, um, um, and at the 13 chapter, verse 4, First Samuel, 13, verse 14. As if the whole kingly authority were nothing else but their general, and therefore the tribes who had stuck to Saul's family and opposed David's reign, when they came to Hebron with terms of submission to him, they tell, amongst other arguments, they had to submit to him as to their king, that he was in effect their king in Saul's time, and therefore they had no reason but to receive him as their king now. Also, they say, in times past, when Saul was king over us, thou whence wast thou wast he that reddest out and brought in Israel, and the Lord said unto thee, thou shalt feed my people Israel, and thou shalt be captain over Israel. So again, this is the idea that all the examples from the Bible, right? Section 110. Thus, when a family by decree grew up into a commonwealth, and the fatherly authority being continued unto the eldest son, every one in his turn growing up under it, tacitly submitted to it, and the easiness and equality of it not offending anyone, every one acquiesced, till time seemed to have confirmed it, and settled a right of succession by prescription, or whether several families or descendants of several families, but whom chance, neighborhood, or business brought together, uniting into society, the need of a general whose conduct might defend them against the enemies in war, and the great confidence, the innocent and security of the poor, but virtuous age. Such are almost all those which begin governments that ever come to last in the world. Gave men one of another, first beginners of commonwealths generally put the rule into one man's hands without any express limitation or restraint. but what the nature of the thing and the end of government required, whichever of those it was at first put the rule into the hands of the single person. Certain it was nobody. Certain it is nobody was entrusted with it, but for the public good and safety. In other words, the purpose of like they were given all this power was to secure everyone's good, the public, the politic, their good and their safety, right? And to those ends, in the infancies of Commonwealth, those who had it commonly used it. In other words, those who held it for the power to do it used it what for the good public good and safety. And unless they had done so, young societies could not have subsisted. Without such nursing fathers, tend and careful of the public weal, the public weal, the common weal, the public weal. This is the public. This is this weird word, the weal. What is this? This is the good, the benefit, the common, the public weal, the common weal. This is that thing which all share. This is that. This is the common. This is that collective good. The thing that they all everyone in this gets is a benefactor from. All governments would have sunk under the weakness and infirmity of their infancy, and the prince and the people had soon perished together. You had to be able to deliver their safety, people's security and their safety. If you couldn't deliver their security and their safety, then the government would not survive. So therefore, they had to have enough power and ability to deliver the the, the, the public weal. The public weal is their lives, their safety, okay, their benefit, their existence, and their safety. 111. But though the golden age before vain ambition and amor seculus habenis, again, this is one of those Latin phrases which um, the love of gain, the desire to acquire. This is that line. This is that very interesting line here. Um, um, Before Benevisions and the desire, this amor secularis seduris, this desire to acquire, right? And Machiavelli, right? The desire, evil concupiscence had corrupted man's mind into a mistake of true power and honor, had more virtue and consequently better governors, as well as less vicious subjects. And there was then no stretching prerogative on one side to oppress the people, nor consequently on the other any dispute about privilege. In other words, it wasn't for ambition and things. Ambition drove people to do things, and that sometimes the people were ambitious as well, or in other words, it's double fold. The problem of leaders, corrupted leaders with ambition and things like this, that in other words, had better virtue and consequently better governors, as well as least vicious subjects, right? Then they have no stretching of prerogative on one side to oppress the people. If the people weren't vicious and doing that to oppress them, or consequently on the other, or consequently on the other, any dispute about privilege to lessen the restraint of power of the magistrate. And so no contest betwixt the rulers and people about governors and government. Yet when ambition and luxury in future ages would retain and increase the power without doing the business for which it was given, In other words, the public thing is for developing the public safety and public good. So therefore, you get this exercise of power and flattery, right? Get all this power, but not deliver on what you're supposed to be doing, right? Um, Doing the business for which it was given. And aided by flattery, taught princes to have distinct and separate interest from their people. Men found it necessary to examine more carefully the origins and right of government. So then what happens is princes who should be dealing with the safety people all of a sudden got lazy or perverted, and they started to enjoy their own pleasure and their things and didn't care what happened to the people, didn't deliver the safety and security of the people. And when the people complained, they said, shut up. I have the power. I have the means. This led people to what? This conflict led people to look at the origins of government, right? That careful about the original and right of government, and to find out ways to restrain the exorbitances and prevent the abuses of that power, which they, having entrusted in another's hand only for their own good, they found was made use to hurt them. Now, here, this is going to be, at this point here, from Future Ages, this quote. This is from Hooker's Ecclesiasticologists. When certain kinds of regiments were once approved, it was nothing, it may be nothing was then farther from the thought upon for them upon thought upon for the matter of governing, but all permitted until their wisdom and discretion were which were to rule, till by experience they found this for all parts very inconvenient, so as the thing which they had devised for remedy did indeed but increase the sore for which it should have cured. They saw that to live by one man's will became the cause of all men's misery. This constrained them into laws wherein all men might see their duty beforehand and know which penalties transgress them. Hooker's Ecclesiastical Polity, Book 1, Chapter 1, Section 10. And again, this is that famous line here. Um, um, I think this is that and then we're going to be long now. Oh God, these. Okay. Thus, we may see how profitable it is that the people that were naturally free and by their own content ever submitted to the government of their father, or united together out of different families to make government, should generally put the rule into one man's hand, and chose to be under the conduct of a single person, without so much as by express conditions limiting or regulating his power. They that thought safe enough in his honesty and prudence, though they never dreamt of monarchy being ulu divino, divine, divinely, which we never heard of all mankind till it was revealed to us by the divinity of the last age. In other words, James the First, James the First, James of Scotland, divine rights of kings, magistrates. Nor ever allowed paternal power to have a right of dominion or to have the foundation of all government. And thus much may suffice to shew that as far as we have any light from history, we have reason to conclude that all peaceful beginnings of government had been laid in the consent of the people. I say peaceful because I shall have occasion in another place to speak of conquest, which some esteem a very beginnings of, which some esteem a way of beginning government. The other objection I find against the beginnings of polities in the way I have mentioned is this, viz., this thing, Section 1 thing, that all men being born under government, some or other, it is impossible for any of them should ever be free and at liberty to unite together and and begin a new one, or ever to be able to erect lawful government. If this argument be good, I ask, how come so many lawful monarchies? How come so many lawful monarchies into this world? How came so many lawful monarchies? For if anybody upon such supposition can show me any one man in any age of the world free to begin a lawful monarchy, I will be bound to show him 10 other free men at liberty at the same time to unite and begin a new government under a regal or any other form. It being demonstration that if anyone born under the dominion of another may be free as to have a right to command others in a new and distinct empire, every one that is born under the dominion of another may be free to be so free too, and may become ruler or subject of a distinct separate government. By this, their own principles, either all men, however born, are free, or else there is no but one lawful prince, one lawful government in the world. So what he's doing, he's creating a false dichotomy here. This is a complete false dichotomy. So if I can't, you can't. If my argument is not true, then your argument is not true. Show me that a prince that this person can form the free government, this monarchy, of this way. Because if that's the case, how can you do it? How come there are all these different monarchies? There should be only one monarchy. Again, this is wonderful because his argument is that the plurality of monarchies disproves their argument of monarchy, because they should also be submitting to one monarchy. Okay, if their argument of authority is right, this is a kind of this is like this is a rhetorical trick. Whatever, both are wrong. Yeah, no, sorry, no social contract, but no doesn't prove, just because that position is not true doesn't prove this. The falsity of the latter does not prove the validity of the former. See, this is a trap. Okay. Uh, uh, in other words, this is why. Therefore, the other thing is not true. Does not prove the validity of the first thing. Okay. Um, okay. And then that have nothing to do with it, but barely have shown us um, enough government of the world, right? It says that all men are either born free or else there is one lawful prince, one lawful government in the world. Okay, this is a false dichotomy in that sense, a false option. And then they have nothing to do but barely to shew us which that is, which when they have done, I doubt not, but all mankind will easily agree to pay obedience to him. This is mocking. This is that chapter 114, though it be sufficient answer to their objection to show that it involves them in same difficulty that it does those they use it against. Yet I shall endeavor to discover the weakness of this argument a little further. All men, they say, are born under government, and therefore cannot be at liberty to begin a new one. Everyone is born a subject of his father, of his prince, and therefore under the perpetual tie of subjugation and alliance. It is plain mankind never owned or considered any other natural subjection than they were born in, to one or to the other that tied them without their own consent, and to their subjugation and theirs. There's this idea. And his plain God never owned or considered any other natural subjugation that they were born in to one or another than tied them without their own consent to a subjugation to them and their heirs. 115. For there is no example so frequent in history, both sacred and profane, as those of men withdrawing themselves in their obedience from the jurisdictions that they were born under, and family or community they were bred up in, and setting up new governments in other places, from whence sprang all their numbers of petty commonwealths, and in the beginning of the age ages, and which always multiplied as long as there was room enough, till the stronger or more fortunate swallowed the weaker, and those great ones again breaking up to pieces dissolved into lesser dominions, all of which are so all of which are so many testimonies against paternal sovereignty, and plainly prove that it was not the natural right of the father descending to his heirs that made governments in the beginning, since it was impossible upon that ground there should have been so many little kingdoms. All must have been, but only one universal monarchy. All must have been, but only one universal monarchy. If men had not been at liberty to separate themselves from their family and the other government, what be it what it will, that was set up in it, and go and make distinct commonwealths and other governments as they thought fit. Let's treat descendants. In other words, all must have been one universal. If men were not at liberty to separate themselves from their families and the government, be it what it will, that it was set up in it, and go and make distinct commonwealths and other governments as they fit. This has been the practice of the world from its beginnings to this day. Nor is it now any more hindrance to the freedom of mankind than they are born under constituted and ancient polities, than have existed laws and set for forms of government, than if they were born in the woods amongst an unconfirmed inhabitants that run loose in them. For those who would persuade us that by being born in any government we are naturally subject to it, and have no more any title or pretense to the freedom of the state of nature, have no other reason batting that of paternal power, which we have already answered, to produce for it, but only because our fathers or progenitors passed away their natural liberty, and thereby bound up themselves and their posterity to a perpetual subjugation to a government, which they themselves submitted to. It is true that whatever engagements or promises anyone has made for himself, he is under the obligation of them, but cannot by any compact whatsoever bind his children or posterity, or his sons, when a man bringing all together is as free as the father, and act of the father can no more give away the liberty of their sons than they can of anybody else. He may indeed annex such conditions to the land he enjoyed as a subject of any commonwealth, but may oblige his son to be of that community, if he will enjoy those possessions which were his father's. Besides that estate being his father's property, he may dispose of it and settle it as he pleases. So therefore, he makes the argument that fathers can't command a son to keep the contract that he entered into. He can do this by giving the property, because the property, but then he can decide to sell the property and go someplace else. Okay, if he accepts the property and lives in it, then he consents to the rule. But if he doesn't consent to the rule, he can sell the property and then go someplace else. Right? That's the argument. But how likely is that? This is not really the case. I mean, because people don't trust foreigners. This idea, I can be free. I don't have to abide by this. I can go to another. Well, wait a minute. Life is too complicated. It's not easy to go from one place to the other. I can come here and do this. But the new places are not going to easily let me just become a citizen of them. It's going to put conditions on my membership. And I might be looked at as a foreigner, as someone who's not trusted. Okay. And that could be, I'm not given the same rights as everyone else here to vote and make decisions. I am not member of the body politic in that sense. I'm not a citizen, or I'm subject to their laws, but I don't have no say in, as a foreigner. You don't necessarily have any say in the representation of election of representatives in the legislature. You have to be given that. You have to be when you become. They accept you and give that to you. Okay, so there's something weird about Locke's argument here because okay, great, you can move, but doesn't mean you're going to be a citizen. You're going to be just a mere subject to this of other people's position. You can be subject to the laws over here, but you're not going to have a right. They're not necessarily going to let you have a right to, and maybe not even your children might have a right in some places. That if you're a foreigner and you don't get in other words, just being born in a place like America, getting born makes you there. All of a sudden gives you the rights of citizenship, but not every state does that. Some, Germany. There's lots of Turks in Germany that are not German citizens. Okay, okay, they were born in there. Doesn't make you become a German citizen. You have to be German to be a German citizen, right? That's the law in that sense. Um, Chapter 117. And this he generally has given the occasion to mistake, has given the occasion to mistake in the matter. This has generally given the occasion to mistake in the matter, because commonwealths not permitting any part of their dominions to be dismembered or to be enjoined by any but those of their community. The sons cannot ordinarily enjoy the possessions of their father, but under the same terms his father did, and by becoming member of the society whereby he puts himself presently under the government he finds there established, as much as any other subject of that commonwealth. And thus the consent of freemen born under government, which only makes them members of it, being given separately in their turns, as each come of age, and not in multitude together, to people take no notice of it, and thinking that it was not done at all, and not necessarily conclude that they are naturally subject. In other words, they're saying that everyone kind of agrees. There's a moment that everyone kind of just, I'm going to take my father's possession. And that act of accepting the father's possession and the obligations under the law for it is the contract. Okay, this is the consent. This is the concept of tacit consent. That long as once you've agreed to follow the rule, once you start follow the rules, once you become of age and have reason, the second you start just follow and you follow the rules and follow the things of the rules and you accept the property, then you've consented. And that therefore, and because no one, because there's each individual doing this, and it's not a big a moment where everyone together does this. Um, People mistake, he says, don't pay attention to it. It's not that at all, and conclude they are naturally subject as they are men. All they are men. Subject 118. Section 118. It is plain governments themselves understand it otherwise. They claim no power over the son because of that they had over the father, nor look on children as being their subjects by their fathers being so. If a subject of England if a subject of England has a child by an Englishwoman in France, whose subject is he, not the King of England's, for he must leave to be admitted to the privileges of it, nor the King of France's, for how then his father at liberty of bringing him away and breed him as he pleases, and whoever was judged as a traitor, a deserter, if he left or warred against the country for having barely born to in it of parents that who were aliens there. It, it is plain then by the practice of governments themselves, as well as the laws of right reason, that a child is born a subject of no country or government. Okay, this is more radical. Children are born like this. only they become government when they hit of age. Okay, it's a really radical position here in this sense. Um, he is under his father's tuition authority till he comes of age and discretion. Then he is then he's a freeman at liberty of what government he will put himself under, what body politic he will unite himself to. And if an Englishman's son born in France be at liberty and may do so, it is evident there is no tie upon him by his father being the subject of this kingdom, nor is he bound up by any compact of his ancestors. And why then hath not his son, by same reason, the same liberty, though he be born anywhere else? Since the power that a father naturally has over their children is the same wherever they be born, and the ties of natural obligation are not bound by the positive limits of kingdoms and commonwealth. Well, this is really, now this is where it gets strange. Now it goes, every child is born, children are not born under the authority of in other words, states would not agree to this. I'm sorry, Locke. States today do care about children's rights and children things, and make a claim that they are citizens and therefore parents have limits to their authority in the sense. Okay, so therefore, no, Locke, no, you're too. Your argument about the maturity of the age before, well, your time has changed, and you're writing when you're writing, your time was immature as states have developed and governments have developed, and the expectations of subjects have developed so great in the rights of them that now what your argument was that before it was so limit. In other words, his argument about the you could use against him now the same argument he used about the nature of early king peoples and populations and their choice of kings. This argument here is almost kind of silly in that sense. And ask why does he do this? Because he wants to argue about the free. This he's forced to make this argument based on this idea that there is this natural freedom and consent, and that consent is always being done, and that one is not obliged. There's no way you can oblige your children to this agreement that you've made. But but in another way you do. You do this all the time. What customs and habits and opinions and beliefs that sometimes you teach your child through education, right? Certain opinions and beliefs that the child doesn't necessarily willfully, knowingly knows. He is taught them and that he believes them. And therefore they become his, and therefore to what degree that does a child what degree does a person willfully not inherit certain traits and things, and particularly in a social state. So therefore, that's that every man being free shown is preternaturally free, and nothing being able to put him in subjugation of any earthly power, but only his consent. It it is to be considered that what be sufficient to be understood to be sufficient declaration of a man's consent to make him subject to the laws of any government. In other words, he has consent to it, right? But it is common distinction of the express and tacit consent. There is a common distinction of an express and a tacit consent, which will concern our present case. Nobody doubts of an express consent of any man entering a society makes him a perfect member of that society or subject to that government. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as a tacit consent and how far it binds, i.e., how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented and thereby submitted to any government where he has made no expression of it at all. And this I say that every man that has possessions or enjoyments of any parts of dominions of any government doth thereby give his tacit consent. So if you once you okay, and by and is as far forth obliged to obedience to the law of government during such enjoyment as one is under it, whether this his possession be of land to him or to his heirs forever, or the lodgings for only for a week, or whereby it be traveling freely on the highway, and the effects in which, as far as very being of anyone within the territories of that government. So therefore, if you kind of engage, or once you start taking the benefits that the government gives, the security, the peace, the freedom to use the roads and everything, not only the land of your property, but once you start choosing to enjoy and engage in the goods that are secured and guaranteed by the Commonwealth, you're consenting to the Commonwealth. That's tacit consent. So therefore, the fact that in other words, this is that therefore, and that once you once you've agreed to this, then you're kind of obliged, as long as you want to keep on using these things and enjoying these things, you're consented to this. Now, the argument is that a lot, and this Aristotle's point about this is that as long as most people don't care, as long as they're not being punished or harmed, as long as government is not harming their interests or their security, they don't care. Only when government starts harming them, then they care, right? And therefore, as long as government is not affecting them, they don't. Most people don't care. Blah blah blah. Don't care. But only when their interests are being harmed or their persons are being harmed, then they start to care. Okay, this is, and therefore, Locke's argument here is more interesting. That the idea here is that once you start enjoying the things that the Commonwealth provides, and once you start using them, be they just the room or the right of the apartment, right? It's enjoying lodging for a week, right? Or barely traveling the freely on the highway. In effect, it reaches as far as the very being of anyone within their territories of that government. To understand this better, it is fit to consider that every man, when he at first incorporates himself into any commonwealth, he, by his uniting himself thereunto, annexed also and submits to the community, whose possessions which he has or shall acquire, that do not already belong to any other government. For it would be a direct contradiction for anyone to enter in society with others for the securing and regulating of property, and yet suppose his land, whose property is to be regulated by the laws of society, should be exempt from the jurisdiction of that government, to which he himself, the proprietor of the land, is subject. By the same act, therefore, whereby anyone unites his person, which was before free, to any commonwealth, by the same he unites his possessions, which were before free, to it also. They become both of them person and possession, subject to the government and dominions of that commonwealth, as long as it has being. Whoever, therefore, from thenceforth, by inheritance, purchase, permission, or otherwise, enjoy any part of the land or annex to, or under the permission, under the government of that commonwealth, must take it on the conditions under that of submitting to the government of that commonwealth, under whose jurisdiction it is, as far as in subject of. Now, this is even more interesting because I can own land. People can own land in other countries. People can have ownership of property. Someone can give you property. Now, yes, when you try to use it, that state regulates it and controls it. And it only controls you in relationship to that property. It has no authority of you, and while you're in its territory, it has authority over you. But it doesn't make you a citizen of it, or gives you a right to necessarily elect, participate in the legislative, elect representatives to the legislature, or even have a say about the rules. You just have to be treated equally under the law in a sense. Uh, but it doesn't. But if you're not living there, they have no authority over there now. They only have authority of you as when you're residing there. But if you own that property and not residing there, they only have they can limit your ability to. In other words, the money you take out, they can tax it and that stuff. But they can't deny you. I mean, unless they want to strip you of your right to own it. Okay, this is what Locke's. This is the flaw, I think. Locke's argument seems to be not to fail to distinguish between who is subject under the law and who is a citizen, who can have a rightful say in the creation of the legislative branch, who is a sharer of sovereignty, right? Who is part of the community? Because remember, all the Commonwealth. If you're a member of a Commonwealth, then you are one of the people who constitute its sovereignty in that sense. Okay, so now, to understand better, that it is fit to consider that every man, when he first incorporates himself to the Commonwealth, he, by uniting himself thereunto, okay, I did read this, but in other words, um, uh, uh, into it and submits to continue the possessions which he has to acquire them that do not already belong to any government, for which the direct contradiction that we read this, right? Blah, blah, blah. So stop here. By that same act, thereby, one unites his person, which was before free, to any commonwealth. By that same, he unites his possessions, which was before free. I read that already, right? To it. They become both of them persons and possessions subject to the government and dominion of that commonwealth as long as it has being. Wherefore, from henceforth, it by inheritance, purchase, possess, permission, and therefore enjoys any part of land so annexed to it under the government of that commonwealth, must take it with the conditions it was under, and that is of submitting to the government of the commonwealth under whose jurisdiction it is, far forth, and any subject to. We did read that, right? I just discussed about. Now, next section. But since the government has a direct jurisdiction over land, and reaches the possessor of it before he had actually incorporated himself into society, only as he dwells upon and enjoys the obligation anyone is under by virtue of such enjoyment is to submit to the government, begins and ends with that enjoyment. So that whenever the owner who has given nothing but a tacit consent to the government will by donation, sale, or otherwise quit that said possession, he is at liberty to go and incorporate himself into any other commonwealth, or to agree with others to begin a new one in vacuus loci, as in any part of the world they can find free and unpossessed. Whereas he that has once, by actual agreement, an express declaration, given his consent to be to any commonwealth, is perpetually and indispensably obliged to be, and remains unalterably subject to it, and can never be again in the liberty of the state of nature, unless by a comedy the government he was under comes to be dissolved, or else by some public act cuts him off from being any longer a member of it. So something has to happen as we separate from it. So once my Locke makes a tacit consent that if I just owned it, you've given it to me. But once if I haven't formally agreed to become a subject of you, and apply to be a citizen, apply to be, apply in the sense to be a citizen in that sense, apply to be, and you've accepted me as a citizen, I cannot then switch. But but if I'm just get this property and I want to enjoy it, I'll enjoy it. But I'm subject to this. I'm subject to the laws and the things. But I decide to sell it and then leave. I'm not obliged. So it's son inheriting the father's thing. Fine. I'm under the authority. If I keep on enjoying it, I'm under the authority of it. But if I haven't said I'm a member, I firmly member, I enjoy, I declare membership for this, then what happens? I just have to sell everything and leave. But what if the state won't let me leave? What if the state? Well, this is the thing that I think Locke might not agree that maybe that the state will see you as a citizen or subject that sorry you there's that you've since you've agreed and accepted these goods and services you have agreed. Tacit consent becomes active consent. By submitting to the laws of any country, quietly living and enjoying privileges and protections under them, makes not a man a member of that society. This is only a local protection and homage due to those from to due to and from all those who, not being in a state of war, come within the territories belong to any government, to all parts wherefore the force of the law extends. But this no more makes a man a member of that society, a perpetual subject of that commonwealth, than it would make a man subject to another, who in whose family he found it convenient to abide for some time, though while he continued in it, he was obliged to comply with the laws and submit to the government he found there. And thus we see that foreigners, by living all their lives under another government and enjoying the privileges and protection of it, though they are bound by, even in conscience, to submit to its administration, as far from any denition, do not therefore become to be subjects or members of that commonwealth. Nothing can make any man so, but his actual entering into it by positive engagement and express promise and compact. This is this is that which I think concerning the beginning of political societies, that that the consent which makes any one member of a commonwealth. So now this is, I think this is what he's doing. He's being careful here. Active citizens versus subjects. Subjects are, I'm sorry, when you're a resident, you're a subject of the law. You may be a foreigner, a resident foreigner, maybe even a resident, but you're a foreigner. You're not a citizen in that sense. Modern conception of citizenship is the new conception of what he's saying as as subject. Okay. The older, so therefore, the subject here becomes a possessor of the commonwealth, a sharer in the sovereignty. Therefore, a citizen. Why doesn't he say that? Why doesn't he come out clearly instead of speaking of? Because if he did that in England, that would be treason. Locke understands that he's not in a republican order. He's in a monarchy, constitutional monarchy, but it's still a monarchy. And if he talks about citizenship, this is something going to be alien to the English, the ear of his audience. So he doesn't use that term. Well, we're over. It's late, and I think I've done this long enough. If you have any comments, we'll end here. This will end the chapter. We look at next time we meet. We will look at chapter 9, which is on the ends of political society and government. If you have any comments, please put it below. If you have comments, criticisms, please put it below. Any questions as well, I try to answer them when I see them. Please like if you like. If you didn't like, you want to put criticism there, put it there. Subscribe, please, if you have not subscribed. And recommend this to share this with a friend and put it in your social media, or share it by email to someone to spread the news if you liked it and you thought someone else will enjoy it. Encourage them to subscribe. You can follow me on social media below. And if you have any, and if you want to help, you can always subscribe. You can always through PayPal, not PayPal, through Subscribestar and uh, uh, Patreon, or you can just buy my book, the which is available at Lulu or Amazon. Um, uh, a notebook for Aristotle's politics is kind of a guide, reading guide. They're kind of how to read. You can buy my other books too. My both on Aristotle. I That's how you can how to help me. That's it for today. See you next time. Take care. Have a good day. Bye bye.